So, welcome everybody and good morning. I'm Fiona Goodwin, Deputy CEO at the EAUC, and this webinar is about the University and College Land for Carbon project, which was funded by the Environment Agency under their Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, CACHI, otherwise known as NERF. And we partnered with MyCarbon, who we're going to hear from a little bit later, and the Woodland Carbon Code. So in this session, we'll have a quick overview of the project. Then Catherine will take us through the Woodland Carbon Code and the institutional guidance we have created for creating a woodland. Then Mike is going to take us through the financial modelling tool for creating a woodland, and then we'll hear from Tom at the University of Leeds to give a case study about what their project is in Gare Wood. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so do use the chat function, or when we get to that point, do put your hand up and come on screen, because it'd be lovely to see you all. So the overview of the project, as I said, it was funded by the Environment Agency. And the whole point of the project was to develop guidance on how institutions can use the land that they have to create Woodland Carbon Code credits. So the Woodland Carbon Code is the UK government-backed credit to help institutions achieve their net zero targets through carbon sequestration. So the carbon credits created can either be used for the institution's own offsetting for their residual emissions in order to meet their net zero targets, or if you have excess credits, you can trade them on the Carbon Coalition, which is the EAUC's offsetting initiative. So the objectives of the project was to develop a sector-wide framework that aligns with the Forestry Standard and the Woodland Carbon Code requirements, develop a market assessment and financial modellings, which Mike will be taking us through. Obviously, we wanted to optimise biodiversity and provide the wider community benefits to both staff, students, and the general public. And a crucial part was using the staff expertise and students to collect and monitor data to gain real practical green skills. So that was really sort of the living lab approach to this project. Unfortunately, a key part of the project was initially to run a pilot, hopefully actually create some woodland. However, there was various challenges and barriers in terms of timelines, in terms of getting the approval and the buy-in from institutions to actually create woodland within their land for that purpose. So therefore, rather than doing the pilot, we've really used all of that learning from that to really develop lots of resources and guidance to help institutions do that. And we're hugely thankful to all of the partners that worked with us on this project to help shape that guidance. And Woodland Carbon Code were an advisory partner of that, and the learnings that we got from University of Leeds are our special advisory partner because they've already gone through that journey. So the supporting resources that we've managed to develop through this is the institutional guidance, which we'll be taking you through, the financial modelling, but also we've developed a business case. And again, that's taking the learnings from the project in terms of what are the barriers, what are the challenges, also what are the different opportunities there are in creating woodland within your land. So there's the business case, which you can edit and use for your own purposes, put in your own templates, for example. We've also got a presentation template as well, which explains a little bit more about creating woodlands and what that means for the institution. We've also developed a list of the grants and funding opportunities that are out there to help you develop your woodland and tree planting, and have a glossary of terms. I'm sure you appreciate when talking about offsetting, there's often a lot of jargon that's used, which can often be a barrier in itself in terms of knowing what do all those different terms mean. So that's a really handy guide for you to sort of get cut through all that jargon, hopefully. And as well as us hearing from Tom today, we've also got a recent case study from the University of Leeds as well. And these are all available on our website, and there's a link to that in the chat function. So I will now hand over to Catherine to go through the Woodland Carbon Code and the institutional guidance. Thanks, Catherine.
Lovely, thank you, Fiona. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm one of the technical helpers from MyCarbon. And yeah, I'll walk you through our institutional guidance. Just to reiterate what Fiona's already said, this guidance is for higher and further education institutions, for example, at universities and colleges, and it's available on their website. And a bit about the Woodland Carbon Code. It's internationally recognised. It's the only way of generating carbon credit through UK woodland creation. It's backed by the government, the forest industry, and carbon market experts. It's a quality assurance standard and generates high integrity, independently verified carbon units, which provide environmental and social benefits to communities. It's currently the only UK carbon code to be endorsed by the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance. So this alliance is like the global umbrella body for carbon reduction and offset providers on this voluntary market. The code also allows organisations to reduce their net emissions, claim carbon neutrality, and assists institutions' route to net zero, whether that be pre-2050 or not. It's a low-risk form of offsetting project. For example, it could be monitored easily within the UK. There's not going to be adverse impacts to local environments or communities from trees. And these removal-based projects are often deemed to be higher quality than other avoidance-based projects because of this direct carbon sequestration. And just to mention that the Woodland Carbon Code for offsetting cannot be used internationally, and this includes not being used for the supply chain and travel offsetting of Scope 3 emissions. Next slide, please. So we've got some requirements, and those include these in the flowchart. So we've got proof of ownership and minimum land size of 0.5 hectares. There's a defined project time commitment, 40 to 100 years. The project must be registered with the Woodland Carbon Code. The site identified has not already been wooded in the last 25 years and does not have an excessive peat depth. And it's worth mentioning in here that woodland is a permanent land use change, and that compliance with the UK Forestry Standard and the Woodland Carbon Code needs to be here too. The project must be validated within 3 years of registration, and this will be revisited after this date to maintain verification. The institution has to have resources to manage the project. So that could be financial, it could be the size of the team involved project managing this. And yeah, once you have all those things in place, you're set up for success. There's more information in our document, of course. And could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so onto our document. And this is one document with sector-specific guidance to help develop woodland carbon code credits, and includes requirements from the UK Forestry Standard. These have been included, as Fiona said, we've had lots of technical advice over the course of the project. So it includes a brief for higher and further education institutions on high-level requirements and project phases. And it can be used for small and large-scale projects. It outlines steps for project initiation, site assessments, financial modelling, which Mike will walk us through, engaging stakeholders, and governance structures. So there's a lot to dig into. It also includes a checklist for project requirements, as these are quite extensive, and documentation list, as this will have to be presented during the course of the project, an overview of key project stages and considerations, and of course, addressing barriers and challenges that we've learned from experience and talking to other institutions, people who have been involved in this type of tree planting project recently in the UK. So we've also developed this flowchart. It lists the development of a project in 5 stages. It highlights the importance of having things like stakeholder engagement, ecological understanding, the environmental impact assessments, community integration, all for like, effective project execution. And there's various different flowcharts available in the main document too. And with that, I'll hand you over to Mike. Mike's a director here at MyCarbon, and he'll talk you through more of the financial side of things.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a miracle I actually remembered to unmute my microphone. I'm just going to do a quick overview of some of the financial considerations of this project, because obviously for institutions or anyone actually looking to undertake something like this, whether it's just a general curiosity or you're heavily invested in this idea, that creating a sort of doing an initial financial model is pretty critical, and you can actually learn quite a lot in the processes as well. So I'll just do a brief intro into obviously what is a carbon credit. A carbon credit is basically a sort of digital asset which represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And Catherine briefly ran through what this meant earlier, but there tend to be 2 forms of this across 2 different markets. Now, the one that we most frequently will talk about is the voluntary market, and you can get removal or avoidance carbon credits. So the Woodland Carbon Code would be a very good example of a removal carbon credit, where the project itself results in direct carbon being sequestered out of the atmosphere and stored in the trees that grow throughout the project duration. And 1 carbon credit of a removal project equals 1 ton of CO2 sequestered. There are other forms of carbon credits. The other common form is avoidance, and they're a little bit less obvious to understand, but basically, if you can justify that the generation of that project avoids carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, then it can be registered as a carbon avoidance project as long as there's a standard available. So a good example of this would be rainforest protection or development of renewable energy projects in developing economies where the financial business case wouldn't make sense without the incentive of the carbon credits. Or something like a cook stove project in a developing economy where more expensive cook stoves are purchased to help avoid burning dirtier fuels or deforesting areas to burn for fuel in those economies. But in general, the oversight here is 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed or avoided from the atmosphere is equal to 1 carbon credit. So you can purchase these on the open market. You can create them yourselves in certain instances. And to offset your footprint, to reach either a carbon neutrality goal or a net zero goal, you would retire this carbon credit, which is in essence deleting it on a permanent register, and that would be a 1 ton of carbon offsetted. If we can move to the next slide, Fiona. So the process of carbon sequestration when it comes to an afforestation or a reforestation project like the Woodland Carbon Code. Obviously, if you look at this chart on the right, if you start planting trees, it takes a lot of time for the initial seedlings to grow and grow into a larger tree. So the curve looks like that you can see on the right over a 100-year period, where for the first 5 to 10, 15 years, you don't get that much action. And then, in the following decades after that, you get this quite large increase on an annual basis. In general, for a Woodland Carbon Code project, the project will sequester somewhere between 400 and 500 tons over the project lifetime per hectare. And there are also other risk buffers that are accounted for in the Woodland Carbon Code standard as well. So if we can see the green section on the chart on the right, they're basically the carbon credits that would be verified and delivered to yourselves as a project developer. And then we got this light blue section, which would be a sort of buffer region. This is almost like a collective insurance policy across the entire of the Woodland Carbon Code standard, where, you know, if something happens to one project, it burns down, let's say, then there is a bit of an insurance process there running in the background. In general, you can also attach other benefits to these credits as well. So, for example, Woodland Carbon Code runs following the UK forestry standards. So in general, it has to be, you know, a relatively good looking project. It has to, you know, account for some sort of biodiversity, water quality, soil quality, all of these things. That's why it's deemed quite a high quality carbon credit versus those that you can get across many other global standards. Can we move to the next slide, Fiona? So I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the tools available that you can look at and use when you kickstart a project. We've also created a bit of a report in terms of how you can use these tools, what you need to actually be able to use them, how they work together, and what sort of outputs that you'll get from them. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll just do a brief overview of the three tools that are available. So the first two, in step 1 and step 2, are some fantastic tools that are readily available on the Woodland Carbon Code website. We've also created a few examples of these and linked them on the project homepage, which I believe has been linked in the chat. But step 1 is to start doing a sort of brief initial design of the actual project itself. And this is done using the carbon calculation spreadsheet. You would input variables such as how big is your land, what's currently on it, you know, what preparation needs to be conducted on this land. But this can be done either in a sort of simplified format or a more accurate format. And if you are genuinely interested in a project like this, I would definitely advise actually going and having a look at this tool, because you can learn quite a lot in the process. And it helps just entering some random numbers like, oh, I've got 50 hectares potentially. It's currently got scrub or agricultural use. And then you can start seeing what sort of gaps there are in your knowledge. And when you notice these gaps, that's when you can start engaging other stakeholders to help support you with a project. The sort of output you would get from this tool would be that chart that you've seen on the previous graph, which gives you this sort of sequestration curve. And, you know, as you gain more knowledge and get further along in this project development process, you begin to start to refine a lot of these answers. So, you know, what blend of tree species do you want to plant on your lands, and how close do you want to plant them together, and all of this sort of stuff. Once you've used that spreadsheet, it will give you this curve, and you can take this data and then begin entering it into the Woodland Carbon Code cash flow spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet begins to start converting those carbon values into a financial analysis, because it's very important to understand what setup costs are involved and what revenues can potentially be generated throughout the project, you know, and the overall project value over the time period. It'll also give you a good understanding of, you know, what preparation costs might be in there. So do I need to protect the seedlings when they're planted? Do I need to put any animal protection around my plot of land? You know, what soil preparation do I need to do? And this tool gives you a lot of good data to try and predict what these costs might look like. It also has a sort of basic estimation of what cost that the carbon might generate throughout the project lifetime. Now, the carbon market itself is relatively volatile, but in general, it's going only in one direction, and these things will only get more important over time. But this spreadsheet is actually quite important, though, because one of the requirements of a carbon credit project, as I mentioned earlier in developing economies, is that the reason you can justify that this is a sort of carbon positive project is that it has to prove something called additionality. And that means that without the creation of these carbon credits, the project wouldn't be financially viable. So, for example, in a developing economy where the capital expenditure for a renewable energy plant might not make sense versus a gas plant, the use of carbon credits can be used to incentivize that. And for the Woodland Carbon Code, that same principle exists as it does over all carbon credit projects, that without the generation of these carbon credits, because we're just planting permanent woodland, the project wouldn't happen. And so that's why you can justify the creation of carbon credits and potentially even the sale of them. So there's a good calculation and a certification process in here that tells you, do I pass that test or do I not, based on the information I put in. And then I have also mentioned this sort of volatility in the price of carbon credits and the potential for extra value creation as the carbon market becomes more valuable over time. And this is a resource that we've developed as part of this project, which is trying to sort of forecast what it might look like, if the carbon market remains quite calm, or if it accelerates, to the moon over the next 30 or 40 years. So the last tool that we've put in here, which again is available on the EAUC project homepage, is a financial modeling tool that sort of gives you the ability to try and forecast, what that end value might be. And if we go on to the next slide, I think there's a bit more. We can skip this one because I've just discussed it. So what we've done is we've created this tool that puts a few sort of pricing scenarios in there. And you can look all over the place on the internet, and there are many of these. Some of them, the value of carbon by 2050 might be $1,000 a ton. It might be a few $100s a ton. But the expectation in almost every case is that as we decarbonize the economy, we decarbonize the easier stuff first and the more expensive stuff later. So as emissions reduce, the value of the carbon market might substantially increase. Now, the UK government has actually done quite a lot of modelling on this based on our own legal net zero requirements. And they have put a carbon modelling forecast in place based on the UK's trajectory to net zero by 2050. They've done a few different scenarios based on fuel prices and economic growth factors. But this is their forecast for what they call the UK's cap and trade market. It's slightly different to the voluntary carbon credit market. But in general, we think that the growth as a percentage is probably quite a fair estimate. So what we've done is we've taken this data out, we've put it in our tool, and then we've re-baselined the starting value based on the current market value of woodland carbon code units. And so you can take your data from your carbon calculator, you can input it in here, and it'll give you a range of potential values of that sequestered carbon over the project lifetime. I know that's quite a lot of information to take in just during a presentation. So if you do want to learn a little bit more on this, the report is on the EAUC project homepage. And I think that's probably the last slide. So I'll pass you over to, where have we got? Tom.
Hi there. Great. Yes, I'm Tom Sloan. I'm a Forest Science and Policy Fellow at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to be talking today about our research, Woodland Gair Wood, which is a project that's a little bit further on, I guess. So this is a project that's about a year old now, in terms of when it was planted, and I'm presenting some work that's been co-produced with Kat Scott, who manages the research program at Gair Wood with me. So we have the next slide, please. So Gair Wood is a 36-hectare site just north of Leeds, and as you can see from the diagram there, it's owned by the University of Leeds, so they own the land, and I think that's been alluded to before. That kind of one of the large obstacles for projects of this type are sort of universities, buy in and actually having the land available to give to schemes like this. It's university-owned land that was previously leased out for grazing, so sort of quite an interesting agricultural grassland. And as well, you can see in the sort of bottom right of this diagram, there's 3 hectares of existing broadleaf woodland at the southeast of the site that was already there, and then the remaining area was just sort of agricultural fields. So as I said, about a year ago on the site, we created a new broadleaf-dominated native woodland for the city of Leeds and for the university. And it's a mixture of direct planting and natural tree recruitment. And this project was developed in partnership with the White Rose Forest. Now, the White Rose Forest is the local community forest partnership for West and North Yorkshire. So there are a few of these community forest partnerships around the country. If you're thinking about developing a project like this, certainly in England, it's worth seeing if you fall within the boundaries of one of these partnerships, because they're a really great source of resources, expertise, support. And also they're a mechanism to get funding. So they administer a lot of the funding that comes from DEFRA and other governmental sources to create woodlands of this sort. So can I have the next slide, please? So Garewood obviously has a role in sequestering carbon, which is what we're talking about today. But one of the important things about the site is that it combines several different aims. And I think, you know, although any woodland that you plant may have the main aim to sequester carbon, it's important to think about a number of different aims and factors when you're bringing together a project like this, just to kind of enhance the overall success and quality of the woodland that you produce. So as I, and I guess many people listening to this are from higher education institutions, one of our main objectives with the site was to create a new venue for research and teaching for the university and for universities, other universities in the region who come and use the site as well. So it's a site for research and teaching for the university. We're aiming to enhance biodiversity. So as I said, it was originally a kind of quite a ecologically dull grassland, which we're hoping to create a range of habitats on and improve species diversity. It forms part of the university's climate plan, which is, I guess, the core topic of our discussion today. It's probably important to note, and we'll talk a bit more about this at the end, that it is only a part of the climate plan. So I think it's important to go into schemes like this with a realistic expectation of how much carbon you are going to sequester, and that anything that you do, you know, if you're looking as an institution to reach net zero, planting a woodland is probably going to have to be part of a much wider effort to decarbonize, so part of a wider effort across campus. And finally, we're looking to create a community resource, so benefit to the local community and to the university. So it's been a venue for, well, it'll be public access, and it's also been a venue for a lot of our outreach and volunteering programs. So next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, we are a research university, and it's probably useful to point out what we as kind of higher education institutions can bring to woodland creation projects like this. Specifically, we sourced a lot of expertise from the university to help in the kind of planning and scoping of the woodland. So an example is just on the screen here on the left. You can see a soil map, and there's a few points on there that detail our various soil sampling points. So as we were planning the project, we looked at the types of soil, we looked at the nutrient regime, the moisture of the soil, and we took all this information and were able to then work out what trees were going to be the most suitable and the most climate resilient for the site, and that informed our design. Next slide, please. And this is the design here. We probably don't have to dwell on this too much, but if you kind of look at the different blobs of green and brown, all of these represent different mixes of trees and different densities of trees as well. So based on what we know about the site, the research we've done to categorize the site, we're able to build a very diverse design for the woodland that's hopefully going to be well adapted to the conditions that it's growing in, and stand a really good chance of meeting those objectives that I laid out. There's also, it's worth pointing out, the cross-hatched area there is an area of natural colonization that we're fencing off to develop, to sort of recruit from local seed sources and develop naturally, and we're going to be comparing this type of woodland creation to the more direct planning that we've done. So Gavin, the next slide, please. So this is a list of the species that are planted on site. There's about 40. The top 30 are the kind of main stand species, and then the remaining 10 are the sort of more scrubby and hedgerow species. Again, this has been designed with site conditions in mind. They're all native, with the exception of Scots pine, they're all broadleaf. And the thing to take away from this is, obviously it's not a commercial timber plantation or anything like that. We're trying to create something biodiverse that's going to stand for a long time, that's going to hold a lot of carbon, but also to be as diverse as possible. So there's a lot of structural diversity built into this. There's different canopy heights, different shade tolerances, and we've really tried to create something that's going to mirror a kind of natural woodland as closely as possible. Next slide, please. So as I've said, the scheme's about a year old. The trees were planted in January and February, and that followed about a year of quite intensive sort of research, design, running through the planning process, consulting with the White Rose Forest, with the Forestry Commission, anybody that could really give us advice. 66,000 trees were planted as part of the scheme. Most of those were planted by contractors, and then a subset of 6,000 were planted by volunteers. So we led a volunteer program. So this fulfills a couple of our objectives, this sort of community outreach and volunteering objective, but also the objective we set for research, because they've helped us plan out quite a large-scale experiment, which I'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. So in tandem, again, going back to being a higher education institution, in tandem with the design and planning process, we ran a consultation with our staff, which brought out a few different research questions and uses. So what we found is, people at the university were really interested and excited that we were creating a woodland, and there was a lot of interest both from sort of colleagues in the STEM fields, but then also we had collaborators from, I think, the Department of Music, some of the arts department. We're going to have some art installations on site. So there really was, when you tell people that you're creating a woodland, there is actually quite a lot of buy-in for this. So we don't have to dwell on this. There's a few research questions that came out, the planted areas versus the natural recruitment we've already touched on. And then at the bottom, impact of species diversity on woodland development. So this is that experiment that the volunteers planted, which we'll talk about in a moment. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is an artist's impression of how the woodland will look in about 15 years. And I just give you a quick overview of some of the long-term monitoring that we have in place. And the little mushroom-like symbols are our temperature probes. So we're monitoring soil temperatures in the woodlands and in the unplanted areas. We have weather stations set up. We're monitoring air quality and air temperature. We've got plots around the site that are looking at seedling survival rates and tree growth rates, and we're also monitoring vegetation. So this kind of has two functions. We're going to be, as we're registered on the Carbon Code, we're going to be kind of verifying our survival rates and how well the plantation's growing, but also it's an opportunity to take students out to do this monitoring and kind of fulfill more than one objective at any given time. Next slide, please. So these are just a couple of examples of the symbols that we've seen on that diagram. On the left, we've got our temperature probes, and we're really interested to see how this is going to develop. I think we'll expect as the canopy closes and the seedlings grow, we'll see real temperature differentials, especially in summer, between sort of cooler forest stands and out in the unplanted areas. In the middle is a soil sample, so we're monitoring soil carbon as well. So this isn't a kind of a verified part of the Carbon Code, but for our internal research, we're interested in how carbon's stored in the soil and the soil nutrients as well. And on the right, that's my colleague, Dr. Scott, setting up our weather station. Next slide, please. And just a last bit on the research. This is just talking about the plantation or the planting that our volunteers did. So we've got 160 10 by 10 meter grids on the site. And our volunteers, there's about 6,000 trees planted across these grids, and our volunteers helped us lay out an experiment looking at the effects of tree species diversity. So we have treatments of either one species, so monoculture of oak, 4 species, 8 species, or 12 species, all planted here. And over time, we're going to be looking at growth rates, how the atmosphere and soil is affected by this changed tree species diversity, and what other animals use the sites of the non-tree diversity. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is an idea of how this was planted. So you can see some of our volunteers standing in the marked out grids and a data collection sheet on the right. So we gave them a set number of trees, and for each of those trees, we know what species is planted and exactly where. So we can go back, monitor these trees time and time again, and have a data set associated with each of the trees that we know is planted in a specific place. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of some of the initial first-year data we're getting off, showing different levels of growth in the different tree species. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up then, some final takeaways from our experience of creating this woodland. The clear objectives are quite crucial. So we have these 4 objectives, and that really informed everything we did on the site and kind of gave us a clear path to the sort of woodland we wanted to create. We found that volunteer engagement was really important for the research component of the project as well to meet some of those wider aims. It's been really rewarding, and I think it's great now to have a resource that we can use for outreach and education. This has been touched on before, but having staff flexibility, and I think this goes hand in hand with having the university willing to provide some land as well, but having the staff flexibility to dedicate long periods of time to the scheme was vital. So as I've said, the kind of planning process took about a year and then 2 months of implementation, and we're still involved. So having some resources to be able to allocate has been really important. And finally, having a realistic idea of the level of carbon, and again, going through the Woodland Carbon Code and making that calculation is going to be really helpful for that. But having a realistic amount of idea of how much carbon is going to be sequestered is going to be really important, because it's not going to be enough to offset the production from a larger institution, but as part of a wider net zero decarbonisation strategy, it can actually be very useful. So next slide, please. So this is just thanks to some of the people that have worked on the project, and there's my contact email on the bottom if you'd like to know more of the scheme. So thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tom. Great to hear that. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can open up for any Q&A now, either regarding the Woodland Carbon Code or the process of how you created Woodland, or any questions that you have for Tom. And I think just on the bit that you mentioned, Tom, about the soil analysis and measuring the carbon in soil, we've been working very closely with SOS UK, who also received funding from the NERF project in terms of developing farming for carbon and nature project, and that was very much looking at soil and the carbon that's in that it really is an emerging field and there's not very much data out there. So and also that project was very much, again, using students as part of that living lab approach in terms of using them to do the data, the monitoring and the analysis, and that's had some really great success stories in there. So good to hear. Gareth, if you've got your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, no, really exciting what Leeds are doing, and we're looking to see if we can do something similar. But the question I've got is very much about the carbon credits and when you claim them and when you retire them. As Tom pointed out, they're probably a little bit of a drop in the ocean compared with what a typical university might be emitting in terms of carbon emissions. So, for example, on that site, would you be looking to claim all the credits when you plant them, and then would you be looking to retire them, presumably in line with your climate plan, and maybe, I don't know what Leeds' target is.
Well, I don't know if Mike or Catherine wants to sort of speak more broadly about the process of actually, when you claim the credits, and then I can talk a little bit about our approach at Leeds, if that.
Yeah, I can very briefly talk quite generally about this. So it's worth mentioning that you can actually claim these credits in two forms. Mm-hmm. So you can claim a pending issuance, which is claimed in advance. So 10 to 15 years prior to that carbon being sequestered. And it's also worth mentioning that these are in such high demand that if you actually want to go and buy these on the open market, you can only buy that form of it. Mm-hmm. What you get when they mature is something called a verified emissions reduction, or what we would classically call as a carbon credit. So realistically, from when you plant, you're not really going to have any of these for the retirable carbon credits for about 10 to 15 years, and they'll go up dramatically after that. So in general, if we were to talk about a 2050 net zero target, and talk about generalized definition of net zero, which would be a 90% reduction in emissions, at that point, that allocation of carbon credits that you produced is actually a much more significant portion of your credits, because ideally you would have reduced by 90% at that stage. So I hope that gives you a sort of better general answer. That
because it gives me a bit of a problem in that our target is net zero by 2030.
Yes. Yeah, that's a trickier one. Realistically, that's 16 years away. So you would start generating credits by then.
No, it's not 16 years away. It's
No,
6.
6 years away. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Well, I guess it's going to be highly dependent on how much you can decarbonize in that point, but there will be a substantial demand for some sort of offset.
But if we're planting our own trees, we really can't be counting our chickens before, or counting our credits before 2040 by the sound of things.
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
And I'll pass over to Tom, who could probably give you a nice example.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it goes. I think it goes back to Mike's the curve that he showed there. Yeah, it's really, trees. The returns in the first sort of 30 years are really not going to be significant. I mean, what I think the way we are. So where are you from, by the way, Gareth?
Cranfield University down in Bedfordshire.
Grand, yeah. So the way the University of Leeds, I'm not particularly involved in a lot of the machinations around the climate plan, but I know the main aim of their climate plan is to really reduce the amount in terms of transport and I think energy. So I think at the moment there's a quite large geothermal scheme that they're trying to get off the ground at Leeds to try and really reduce the actual emissions. Where Garewood's kind of, because it's only become a real thing in the last year or so, we're kind of a late addition to the climate plan, so nobody was really depending on us to deliver anything extra. We're kind of a nice bonus at the end, but I think where we fit into the longer term planning is, no matter how much you decarbonize, there's always going to be this little sort of residual production that's quite hard to shift, and I think in several decades that's actually where we can think that we're going to make a reasonable contribution. So certainly not something that's, if we're shooting for 2030, which I think Leeds are as well, that's not something that's going to be helpful. But over the longer term, and as you suggested, there's no plan to trade the credits or anything like that. They'll be for our internal accounting.
Yeah. No, that's great, Tom. Thank you very much. And I think our thinking is similar in that this would be to treat kind of residual emissions that you just can't do anything about. But the timescales are interesting.
Just one quick point to add there as well, that the pricing curves will continue upwards until like 2050, 2060. So in terms of having to purchase your own offsets at 2030, the cost will likely be lower per unit. It will be at that sort of more mature end of the global zero curve. So the cost savings from having your own project would be much more significant at that point in time anyway, because that'll be the stage where purchasing offsets from someone else will be significantly more expensive.
And I think that all goes to illustrate, the long-term planning that is required for this in terms of having that kind of long-term approach. And that's obviously one of the benefits of creating a woodland, but also one of the challenges as well in terms of making that commitment to that land for at least 100 years, for example. So I'm just going to address a quick comment in the chat. So Alex was asking, any plans for Scottish pilots? This project was funded by the Environment Agency, so by that we were restricted to England only, but we have tried to make the guidance as applicable for any of the nations across the UK and Ireland as much as possible, so they should all still be applicable. We did actually try to have some apply for some similar funding in Scotland, however we weren't successful, but we will continue if there's any future potential funds for that, because we'd also like to do a similar project looking at peat, for example, as well as the Woodland Carbon Code. So there's the Peatland Carbon Code as well as the Woodland Carbon Code, which are the two current UK government-backed schemes. I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, so I apologise firstly. Chelia?
Hello, hi. Yeah, it's quite awkward. I apologise. Very close though, Shayla.
Shayla, sorry about that.
That's all right, no problem. Yeah, thank you. It's been really, really interesting hearing everybody talk. I'm a student at the University of West of England, UE, in Bristol. And I've been trying to campaign to get the university to reserve. They have a site that's earmarked for development. They're not sure what they're going to develop on it at the moment, and I'm trying to campaign for them to do something similar to this. And I didn't know this existed until today, so it's really exciting to hear all these great things that are happening. And I just have sort of a general question as to how I make this the most appealing to my university over, say, the profits that they could accrue from developing on that site. It's 9.5 hectares, so it's reasonably large. I think there's a lot of potential, and it's been sitting fallow for around 15 years, so it's really, really exciting, but I'm finding it hard to communicate I suppose the benefits, and communicating the benefits in a way that shows it's perhaps more valuable than sort of building on it. I don't know, do you have any advice?
Certainly, and so that was obviously one of the challenges that we found throughout this project, is that as and when institutions found out that they did have some land or piece of land that was potentially could be used for creating woodland, then other uses for that land came forward, and that is the challenge in terms of, therefore, it might be more profitable, for example, to sell the land for development or build a car park, for example. So those are the sort of the barriers and challenges for that. As part of the project, we developed two key resources that hopefully should help you. One is sort of a business case, which kind of talks you through the benefits in terms of doing that, as well as a presentation template which you can use to show, again, so those benefits in there, and the financial modelling tools in that can show you sort of the to give the financial side of things in terms of how much it will cost, but also how much carbon it will sequester, and therefore looking at how much that could potentially save the institution in the long term in terms of creating their own carbon credits. So there's lots of resources on there, and I think obviously there's sort of the various benefits, but as Tom has shown with his project, by integrating it with the research side and the curriculum side, that has huge additionality benefits in terms of providing real life experiences for the students, for research purposes, for data monitoring purposes, for volunteering purposes, also the wider community as well. And obviously there is the whole health and wellbeing angle as well, in terms of providing access to green spaces and nature. So the benefits are huge, and hopefully all those resources will be able to help you.
That's great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Jo.
Sorry, just finding all the buttons. Hi. So I'm firmly with my UKRI fashion nerd hat on. I don't want to bring doom and gloom on the party. Instead, more some skeptical thinking or challenge. I think it's brilliant to see all the woodland being planted by universities. It's nice to see that there is investment being put in, and obviously, as you said, there's lots of additional benefits, biodiversity, all that jazz. I think what concerns us from a research and evidence point of view, so very much with our science hat on, is the lack of evidence for genuine long-term additionality, the permanence of this capture. I mean, we've talked about sort of 50 years on insurance policies, making sure the land stays woodland, but there's a real skeptical part of my brain that suggests that what happens to this carbon in 100 years? Are we not just throwing money at something that actually is not guaranteed to be locking that carbon in? So are we not just pushing this on to future generations?
What?
We don't know what the climate's going to be like in 100 years' time. In fact, the IPCC is correct. It might not be suitable in some parts of the country for what we're planting now. I just wondered what's the thinking, if you could talk a bit more about this long-term permanence of this as it being an offset scheme rather than maybe carbon contributions towards something really good.
really valid points, Joe. And actually, through the project, that discussion in terms of what tree species should be grown, obviously, the Woodland Carbon Code guidance is very much sort of native trees. However, as you might say, you know, in 100 years, 50 years, our climate is going to be very different. So what those trees will be able to withstand, you know, in terms of, you know, when we were working with the University of Southampton, for example, they're looking at more Mediterranean species, in terms of they're more likely to have survival rates in 50, 100 years time, rather than sort of more traditional native trees. So those discussions are going on, but the research is really emerging. It is really early days. And I think obviously, you know, there are those kind of discussions to have in terms of trying, you know, balancing the need for having or wanting native trees to actually looking at that forward projection of the weather in the future. And just also on the biodiversity angle as well, the Woodland Carbon Code, whilst obviously they focus on the woodland, as the name suggests, but they are looking into whether there is a way that they can measure the biodiversity angle of that. And that, again, that's very early days in terms of that. And just going back to the soil carbon and the data monitoring, it's really an emerging field. So these projects are really needed to really feed that research and get the data and monitor that. And that's where, you know, we've been, both us and SOS have been kind of tripped up by how difficult this is because there isn't enough data. So I think, you know, the more that we can encourage institutions to do this and you know, follow Tom and Kat's leads in terms of having a really strong research element to it, provides us with that. And that's the same with hedgerow. So there's a hedgerow carbon code coming out or being developed, but again, really emerging things. And that's what the funding from the Environment Agency was all about: emerging markets, emerging areas, and where we need to do more. So I think that's a really valid point, but I'll let Mike or Catherine come in on the more offsetting part.
Yeah, I was just going to add a few points, because as you said, Fiona, it was discussed quite often, and also as part of the Carbon Coalition, this is mentioned quite frequently as well. And I think it's, I'll make a few comparisons that we made during the project that, you know, global afforestation projects, you know, I would agree that there is definitely an additionality, a long-term storage reliance issue, right? That, but in the UK, obviously, this requires a permanent legal land use change. I think, you know, the project duration has to be a minimum of 100 years for it to actually be certified. At which point, if someone did want to change the use of that land, they would have to apply for planning. And the fact that it was a carbon verified project would probably be an issue at the time of the land use change element. But also, I think in general that, you know, this tends to be a relatively resource efficient style of sequestration, because there aren't actually many options available on the carbon market at the moment. Obviously, research going to direct air carbon capture is you know, it's an option, but in terms of resource efficiency, it's a relatively relatively high cost form of sequestration, even though you get that indefinite longevity to the carbon capture. We did also discuss, like, you know, adaptations to these sorts of projects in the future, that, you know, you can in essence recycle the carbon sequestration capability of the land through felling or even conversion to lumber at the end of the project duration. And that would almost be on an indefinite basis, that you could create further guarantees of locked carbon by taking this lumber and storing it in building projects. And there are some fantastic sort of monitoring certifications coming out within construction, the construction life cycle, where you can in essence assess the locked carbon, the locked biogenic carbon from cradle to grave for the duration of that building project. So yeah, I would say in the future, combining those sorts of technical elements, you know, we should be able to get some pretty good guarantees of you know, sequestered carbon locked for a significant period of time. But obviously, a 100-year period is such a chaotic timescale to try and forecast these things perfectly. So there is always uncertainty, but there's also a huge amount of opportunity.
Yeah, I think we're just concerned that this is This is leaving it for our grandkids to deal with. You know, that these are all biological solutions that at some point will release carbon back into the atmosphere. And I just wonder whether this is a language issue, that actually there should maybe be a differentiation between permanent offset and something that is like 100 years, 150-year offset in organic materials, because I don't think we're talking about the same stuff. There's one that's literally, this carbon is being put into the atmosphere and it's gone. And we're putting this carbon back into the atmosphere for now. But actually at some point, someone's still got to deal with it.
Absolutely, and just 2 points on that. One is, one of the main challenges with the institutions part of the pilot was institutions agreeing to that 100-year in terms of committing that land for that length of time. Institutions are notoriously risk averse, so trying to plan for 100 years time, that was a bit too much for certain institutions in terms of doing that. So I think that's like the other end of the spectrum, if you like. But as Mike says, as part of the Carbon Coalition, which we have an advisory board that sits under that, we've had many conversations of how permanent is permanent. So even the permanent ones aren't that permanent. It depends what your timeline is, obviously, but that is an ongoing issue. But I think the language is useful, and having that more sort of direct carbon capture and storage. But again, there's a huge research gap there. There's not enough research going on. There's not enough projects going on. It's notoriously expensive. So again, there's a research gap there. So Tom, where you got your hand raised?
Oh yeah, I think most of the points have been covered. But I guess just to add, I agree that that's it's certainly a concern in the sort of wider discussion about these land use changes and carbon sequestration. I would say that's kind of built into our project in that we are looking at a quite intensively planted woodland, but at the same time we will be comparing that to an area of natural recruitment and looking at whether that, using local adapted seed sources, will be more resilient and whether it will have a better long-term outcome. I think it's also probably worth mentioning, so with we tried to employ best practice on this project, but adhering to UK forestry standard, there are certain steps you take to try and improve climate resilience. There's UK forestry standard advice. There's also woodland trust advice and various other advices about tree provenance, so trying to source provenances that are going to be more climate resilient. And certainly for the research that we were talking about when we were planning the site, the sort of soil and nutrient work, that all gets fed into Forestry Commission tools. So a common one is the ecological site classification. And with the kind of the soil type and nutrient type that I was discussing earlier, you can actually run it through basic climate scenarios so that the species that we planted are, under these climate models, hopefully going to be suitable, at least in that sort of century. As you say, after that, there's an open question. But I think there are things, just to say, it's not a silver bullet, but there are things you can do to make it as resilient to climate change as possible. But yeah, a lot of unanswered questions, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm very aware that we are on time. So we will be sending out the links when the recording is available. The slides are also available on our project page, along with all of the resources. So I really do encourage you to go and have a look at those resources. And just to say a big thank you to Catherine and Mike from My Carbon for their work on this project, and Tom and Kat from Leeds in terms of being that special advisory partner and providing all the case study information has been fantastic. And thank you for the Woodland Carbon Code for all of their expertise that they brought to this. And with that saying as well, big thank you to Jenny from my team in terms of all the help and support she's provided to this project. And again, thank you to all the institutions that have really fed into into all of the guidance documents and the project as we've developed. So a huge thank you to everyone. So we will leave it there, and thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Thank you.